Welcome everyone to SRUW's program today with Dr. Kirsten Ostherr on medical humanities. I'm Julie Connor. I'm the president of the Society of Rice University Women, and this is our fourth program this fall. It's the final regular daytime program in the fall, although we do have 2 evening programs coming up with authors. Just to remind everyone, please mute yourself. Please put your questions in the chat line. And please get ready for a photo. We're going to have a photo of us all, which will be put on our Facebook page. So if you want to be in the photo, just turn your camera on if you have one so that you can be in the photo. Our Rice Alumni Office Liaison, Carrie Pius, is going to do the photo for us. Carrie, you want to wave so everyone can see you? Over to you to give instructions on the photo.
Okay, I'm just going to do a countdown. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay, great.
All right, thank you. I'd like to turn the program over to the program coordinator for today, Electra Elliott. Electra?
Thank you. Thank everyone for joining us today. Dr. Kirsten Ostherr is the chair of the Rice English Department and Gladys Louise Fox Professor of English. Dr. Ostherr is also the founding director of Rice's program in Medical Humanities and is the founding director of Rice's Medical Futures Lab, a research collaborative that explores medicine as it intersects with technology. Dr. Ostherr's current book project is called Quantified Health, Making Stories from Data in the Algorithmic Age. Rice Alumni in Medicine is co-sponsoring today's talk. I'm not sure if anyone is on here from Rice Alumni in Medicine, but welcome. And the title of our talk today is Medical Humanities in the Time of Pandemic, Learning from Images, Narratives, and Data. Welcome, Dr. Ostherr.
Thank you so much for having me. Is it possible for me to share my screen? Do you have that setting turned on?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go ahead and do that because I have some images I would like to share with you. So let me just get into. Okay. Now, if you can just confirm, do you just see one slide or do you see multiple panels?
One slide. I just see.
Perfect. Okay, great.
Well,
so
now, okay, for a second there, I clicked and I could see multiple, but now it's just one.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll share some of the work that I've been doing since the pandemic started, really, and in relation to the work that we do in medical humanities. And as suggested, I'll plan to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I thought that the way that I would start is by talking about 3 different areas of research that I have been engaged in as they have taken on a particular relevance in the context of the pandemic. So first, I want to talk to you about some historical research I've done on the history of medical and public health films, and particularly films that talk about global contagion. That was actually what my first book was on, that was published back in 2005. So it was long before the pandemic, but because of the relevance of that research to the current situation, the publisher, Duke University Press, issued an open access version of the book this spring in February or March, so that it would be available to scholars who were, and members of the general public who were trying to contextualize what was going on. So I wrote a bit about that work recently in relation to the current situation. So I'll talk a little about that and show you some images from that. Then I want to talk about my more recent work, which has to do with the relationship between data and narratives in medicine and public health. And then in the last part, I want to talk to you about a project that I started that was funded by the Rice COVID Research Fund, and that began this past summer with a group of undergraduates and graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, as well as other faculty, all at Rice. So we have a team of about 10 people working on this, and I'll tell you about that at the end. So as the pandemic took hold in March, I wrote a piece that was published in the Washington Post, which you can see an image from here, that was really looking at the history of public health films that represent contagion, and in particular, the global spread of contagion. And this, as I said, was something I'd written my first book about. And one of the things that I found in the research I did for that book was that motion pictures, since they were invented in the 1890s, have often sought to represent contagion visually. And the problem there, of course, is that we cannot see the spread of contagion with the naked eye. So we always need some kind of displacement of the idea of contagion onto something that is visible with the naked eye. And the way that this has often worked is that contagion has become racialized. So it has been represented through images of bodies that are themselves depicted as racial and as different and other, or you could say as stigmatized. So the thing that really stood out to me in looking over my research in relation to what was happening at the present moment was just how many similarities there were between films that were made, in the 1920s and the 1950s, and imagery that we were seeing in 2020. So I thought that I would show you a couple of really brief clips from some of these older films, because they have resonances that I think are just uncanny. Now, the style of these films is nothing like the style of films made today. But the imagery and the kind of the themes are very reminiscent, I think. So first, I want to show you a clip from this film called Prevention of the Introduction of Diseases from Abroad. It was made by the US Public Health Service in 1936. And I'm going to show you about 1 minute of it.
The danger of introduction of diseases from abroad has paralleled in growth the remarkable development of transportation on the sea, on the land, and in the air. The transportation of disease has been as much facilitated by improved mechanical methods as has the transportation of persons or property. Maritime quarantine was at first undertaken by the states and cities, but is now administered by the Public Health Service at all the ports of the United States and its possessions. To perform these functions, the service has been given quarantine jurisdiction over all ships and all persons, both citizens and aliens, coming into American ports from abroad. In its quarantine work, the United States Public Health Service maintains a fleet of trim and speedy boarding tugs, which carry the quarantine officers out to the vessels arriving at United States ports. The danger of introduction of disease.
There we go. So the thing that I just want to show you that brief clip. The film goes on for much longer, of course. But if you recall, one of the early moments of the pandemic had to do with all these cruise ships around the world that were stranded in ports or trying to find a port where they could land, and being forced to quarantine all of the passengers and crew on those ships. And I was just really struck by that, because this, as you heard in that film, was actually the beginnings of the whole concept of how to manage the spread of contagious disease around the world. So it was that imagery was very, very reminiscent of what we saw from the 1930s. Now I want to show you a brief clip from another film here. These are the only two I want to show you. But this is called The Eternal Fight, and it was made by the UN and the World Health Organization in 1948, which was the year the WHO was formed, actually, as an organization. And what they're trying to do in this film is help people to visualize the spread of invisible contagion around the world. So you saw the emphasis in the previous film on modes of transportation, ships, trains, airplanes. And you'll see in this clip too that there's a strong emphasis on the way that global travel is complicit with the spread of contagious disease. So I'll just show you again about 1 minute of this.
Countries, contagious diseases exist in an endemic state, that is, permanently. India, for instance, has certain areas that are always infected with cholera. This plague can extend to Western Europe. In Africa, some forms of malaria still rage, germs that might easily be transmitted to South America. Cholera in Japan could strike suddenly at the west coast of the United States. Permanently infected zones are localized, but may cover large areas of territory, sometimes entire continents. Modern transport poses new dangers of complete universal contagion. The struggle against epidemics is a global one, for the danger of death is worldwide. Then, what is the answer? Within the framework of the United Nations, a new organization exists to promote the welfare of all people. The World Health Organization. In its first assembly, July 1948.
Okay, I'm not going to play the entire film here either, but I wanted you to see not only the dramatic visualization of the invisible spread of contagion, but also, again, the way that this film itself represents certain parts of the world as being dangerous sources of contagion that must be blocked off from the parts of the world that are vulnerable to that contagion. So there's a very important role that global maps play in this imagery, and arrows that are drawn from one part of the globe to another to visualize the spread of contagion. And I'll say a little bit more about this as I talk about my recent writing on some of these topics. So in the piece that I published in the Washington Post, it basically talked through several films, the two that I just showed you clips from, as well as a number of others, to show the ways that certain kinds of themes and imagery repeat over and over again in different historical moments, though, of course, with some variation. And the variation part is interesting because, as it happened with academic research, oftentimes we do research, we write the research and submit it for publication, and that whole process takes, maybe a couple of years sometimes. So I had an article come out in a book collection this May or April that I had written a couple of years ago, and I had actually written it about the Zika virus. And at that time, that was a global threatening disease that was of concern on pretty much every continent. And that was published in this book that was published with Amsterdam University Press. And they also made that chapter available open access early before the book itself was published, because they themselves saw the relevance of that article to understandings of the current pandemic. And in fact, my own thought as I looked back at that piece in the context of the coronavirus pandemic, I thought, wow, much of this article could be rewritten, switching out Zika for coronavirus, and the argument would remain very similar. But that also got me thinking, what aspects are different? And looking at that comparatively across time and across infectious diseases has been very illuminating for me, because oftentimes what these comparisons show us are the ways that social and cultural dimensions of understanding disease and visually representing disease really shape how we behave in a way that often goes far beyond any biomedical understanding of the actual disease that we're talking about. So In addition to that Zika virus piece, which came out, I was invited to write a piece about COVID for a journal called American Literature, which this piece just came out in October 6th. It's available open access right now, if anyone wants to look at it. And this piece I did write this past spring as the pandemic was spreading around the world. And what I really wanted to do in that piece was just think systematically about the visual iconography of COVID in relation to some of the historic diseases that I had studied and written about in the past. And I want to just show you a couple of interesting comparisons of the types of imagery that we see very often. So one thing we always see when these outbreaks occur is microscopic images of the virus. We saw and still do see the SARS-CoV-2 image. And with Zika virus, we saw imagery of that virus too. What's interesting to me is that for the general public, these images often don't really teach us anything useful, yet they are very widely pursued and represented, despite the fact that unless you're a research scientist, these particular images may not be of great use. And I'm happy to talk more about why I think that is in the Q&A. We also see a lot of images of disease vectors, but this has been really interesting as a comparison between Zika and coronavirus, because with Zika, the vector, of course, was mosquitoes. So all of the effort was put into eradicating the source of the infection. With coronavirus, of course, it is presumed that it originally jumped species from a bat to another animal to humans. But it's not bats that are spreading the disease now, it is humans. So that really changes the visual iconography of the contagion. And instead, we have a lot of imagery of people wearing or not wearing masks. But I want to dwell on this for a minute because the imagery of disease vectors has also often been an imagery of xenophobia. So this is a poster that was featured in a film that was made during World War II about malaria, which was a big problem, especially in the Pacific Theater, but also when troops were stationed in the southern United States for training. And as you can see in this poster, it used a very racist depiction of South Asian or Japanese sort of stereotypes, racial stereotypes transposed onto the image of the mosquito with the wings mimicking the Japanese flag. As a way of cultivating a sense of motivation to fight against this invading disease. With coronavirus, especially in the early weeks of the pandemic, there was a lot, as you may recall, of anti-Asian language and rhetoric being spread around in terms of calling it a China virus or a Wuhan virus and those sorts of things. There was a lot of coverage of an eminent Chinese virologist who was described as a bat woman instead of as a scientist in a lot of media coverage. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I'll leave that for our discussion if you want to return to that later. Maps of contagion also. This is something you see in every film. You saw this in the film The Eternal Fight that I showed you a clip from a minute ago, but it goes back to films from the 1920s. We always have imagery of the global spread of contagion. One of these maps is from Zika virus, and the other is the Johns Hopkins data dashboard, which is probably very familiar to you all. We often see health workers in face masks and biohazard suits, and I have been really struck in the current pandemic by the way that the biohazard suits and other forms of PPE, of course, are also symbolic of the lack of preparedness for this pandemic, as well as the dehumanization that occurs in hospitals where patients are cared for by healthcare professionals whose faces they cannot see. That imagery has a very different narrative associated with it in the current context. Lastly, often we see images of visibly ill patients, and those are often used to galvanize viewers' responses to try to persuade them to do what needs to be done to avoid the disease. And in the case of Zika, it was babies born with microcephaly that would affect the shape of their skull, which would be very visible as in these photographs. In the case of COVID, as you know, the press has not largely been allowed inside of hospitals, inside of COVID wards in particular, both because it would pose a risk to them and because they themselves may pose a risk to patients and to healthcare professionals. And so as a result, we have not seen nearly the kinds of images from inside of hospitals of suffering patients as we typically would in other kinds of outbreaks, such as with Zika virus, for example. So when we do see images of patients, usually, especially in the United States, they are anonymized, and that's to protect their privacy. So you see, as in this image, you see the healthcare workers caring for a patient in some way bedside, but you don't see usually the face of the patient themselves. So that's a whole bunch of different kinds of images that you can see that I've been analyzing in comparison with other outbreaks to try to understand some of the themes and significance of the ways that that COVID is similar and different to other contagious disease outbreaks of the past. I want to talk just briefly about COVID and data-driven narratives. So another piece that I wrote early in the pandemic that I published in STAT, which covers health and technology. I wrote about telehealth and privacy, basically, in the context of COVID-19. A lot of my research in the past several years has been about health data, trust and privacy. And one of the things that I emphasized in that work, and I've been writing a lot about this recently as well, is the extent to which our dependence on telehealth in the context of the pandemic also is exposing all of these privacy vulnerabilities, but also raising interesting questions about trust and how we connect with healthcare workers and what difference it makes to be in person in terms of forming healing relationships. So that's a really big question. But I'll just touch on a couple of themes that have come out of this. So my research has been asking how technology and data have shaped the course and epistemology of the pandemic. And you already saw the Johns Hopkins data visualization. Here is a version based on similar software, open source software. This is for Harris County. And one of the questions that I'm really interested in is the extent to which we relate data to narratives about what the data mean, specifically in relation to human beings and how we are responding to the pandemic and the kinds of suffering that are entailed, which you don't really see in these numbers, even when you have listings of thousands of fatalities and tens of thousands of deaths. And I've written a bit about contact tracing. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on that here, but I wanted to just note that contact tracing itself, while it is connected to issues about testing and preventing the spread of disease, it's also very much entwined with issues around trust. Harris County Public Health has a list of contact tracing myths that they post on their website that address commonly asked questions such as, can I get deported if I cooperate with a contact tracer, or will I lose my children due to COVID-19? So these are issues that are very human issues that relate to the experiences of people's lives that are often lost in these kinds of visualizations. So it's that tension that I'm really interested in. A similar version of that has to do with the way that digital contact tracing has worked. So in certain countries, not the United States so much, but in South Korea, for example, and in China, digital contact tracing has been widely used alongside a lot of other quite invasive surveillance techniques in order to gather enough information to track the spread of the virus and prevent the continued spread. And a number of physicians and others have recounted that these that worry and lack of trust about disclosing both diagnoses as well as behavior are so strong in these hyper surveillance societies that many people would rather, in this quote, die from the virus than be exposed as someone who might have spread the disease. This was also found in studies of contact tracing in Ebola, in the Ebola outbreaks in Liberia from a couple of years ago. A lot of emphasis on stigma, shame, and mistrust. So these are themes that I'm really interested in exploring in relation to the data about the spread of disease. And I also want to highlight the extent to which, when we think about data, we always have to think about what's missing. So this is just an image from a story about how access to testing may depend where you live. And this was focusing on Texas. Houston actually came out quite well as compared to other Texas cities in terms of having, in terms of not having racially biased access to COVID testing. But it points out the fact that the testing data, which we depend on to understand the spread of the virus, is not evenly distributed, and there are gaps in it. You don't need to read this whole text, but I wanted to just show the extent to which data are not only often missing, but often messy too. So Harris, or rather, this is actually the UT School of Public Health, which is where I got my Master's of Public Health degree some years ago. They have an elaborate explanation of all of the ways that the data that they base their mapping on are complicated and messy, because that's the reality of statistical modeling. And I just appreciate how much text it takes to explain that. So a few kind of big points that come out of this. Technology is always socio-technical, meaning that testing technology and digital contact tracing are always embedded in social systems that really shape how they are used and what meaning we can make of them. But they're also always missing and messy data. And in my view, the current pandemic really makes clear the extent to which medical and health humanities really need to engage with both technology and data to help us see the human pieces of this pandemic and the extent to which we cannot understand or bring an end to the pandemic solely through technological or scientific interventions alone. All right, so just to wrap up here, I wanted to tell you a little bit about this last area of work that I've been doing since about May, which is this project called Translational Humanities for Public Health. So I developed, along with this team that I mentioned earlier, a survey to document and then publicly disseminate the kinds of work that are based in the humanities, like my own work that I've been telling you about today, but there are many, many different kinds of scholars out there doing all kinds of work that's really dedicated to intervening in the pandemic and making life better for communities, for healthcare professionals, for policymakers, for lots of different kinds of groups. And I wanted to collect and disseminate this information because, in my view, it is really important to addressing that question I was asking earlier about how to present the human narratives of the data that characterize the way that we see the vast scale of this pandemic. So one example of this kind of work is a scholar in Asian American studies who started very early on documenting xenophobic attacks against Asian people in the United States, against the Asian American community. And he was doing this because he noticed a pretty rapid uptick in xenophobic attacks, violent xenophobic attacks, that he wanted to document so that policymakers would be aware and could intervene. So that caught my attention early on. Of course, there's a really long history of mistrust of healthcare institutions in many ethnic and racial communities in the United States who have suffered disproportionately in various ways over the histories of their histories in this country. And this scholars who work on this on these topics know that this will then influence ways that people participate in contact tracing, for example, but also in vaccine trials and in getting vaccinated as well. So this is a huge area where scholars in African American studies, as well as many other racial and ethnic studies areas, are really needed to make sure that the ways that we address the pandemic are not themselves also contributing to the extension of health disparities. Also, I was really fascinated by this. So the United Nations made a call for creatives early on in the pandemic, asking people to contribute their own versions of artwork that were local to their geographical and cultural areas, and that they thought would make sense to and be kind of comprehensible to people from their local communities. So they recognized on a certain level that the kinds of representations and health communication messages that could come out of a centralized body like the WHO might not really resonate with all of the different communities who needed to be engaged in stopping the spread of coronavirus. So they asked creative artists all around the world to contribute. And if you actually go to the UN Call for Creatives site, there are just hundreds of really fascinating and beautiful images there. I mentioned already my own piece in the Washington Post, which to me, writing that kind of stuff is it's a translational move because it's about disseminating this work beyond the scholarly community to the general public so that we can think critically, but also creatively about how to represent the spread of contagion in a way that doesn't just reproduce racist imagery and racist narratives. I also wanted to point this out because this is the importance of history. So this is a piece from Scientific American that was published in March of 2020, and they basically summarized then lessons learned from the SARS outbreak of 2002-2003, as well as from the 1918 influenza pandemic, where they learned some really basic things which are not high tech, but which are effective, as summarized here: social distancing, communication, and international cooperation as the most effective methods to slow COVID-19. So this is something that we learn from historical research, and that if we had put into place in a very systematic and proactive way early on, could make a really big difference at a pretty low cost. There's a group that does what they call global health histories, including seminars for the WHO. I did one of these a few years ago. And here too, the idea is to translate historical work in forms that are useful for current policymakers and health experts who are trying to intervene in current outbreaks by learning from the past. So to me, this is also an important kind of translational work. And I note that in some countries, actually, such as Germany, philosophers and historians of science and theologians and jurists were part of the committees that were helping the government to figure out their policies about reopening and make lots of other decisions, which they acknowledged were ethical decisions in addition to being scientific decisions, as well as often political decisions. So I thought that was a really important point that I just wanted to share with you. So mainly, let me just, one more point and then I'll wrap this up. A philosopher named Kwame Anthony Appiah wrote in 2010, he wasn't writing obviously about the current moment, but he wrote about what he considered to be moral failures of our society. And he called them places of warehousing: prisons, factory farms, and nursing homes. And a writer named Dylan Matthews picked this up in a piece in Vox in May of this year, noting that these were the exact sites where some of the worst outbreaks were happening, some of the worst COVID-19 outbreaks. And he really raised this question: how do we think about the data on the global distribution of this pandemic in relation not just to where biological spread has occurred, but also in relation to the value systems that could have led to these specific sites being the sites of outbreak in the first place? What can we learn by thinking in that direction about how these data have come to be. So there's a lot more to say about that. And I would be happy to talk about that in the discussion, but just in the interest of wrapping up, I'll just conclude with one last slide, which is, and this is a study that was produced by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in 2018, where they published this report called Branches from the Same Tree. And in it, they were arguing basically that the humanities and the arts really need to be reintegrated with science, engineering, and medicine in ways that they used to be long ago, but they've since, all these fields have since all kind of split off into their own areas of specialization. And what they were arguing was that by bringing these back together, we can foster greater critical thinking abilities, higher order thinking and deeper learning, content mastery, problem solving, teamwork and communication skills, improve visual spatial reasoning, and general engagement and enjoyment of learning. And I had been aware of this report since it came out, but I was looking at it again recently and just thinking about how valuable actually all of these skills are in pandemic response, and the extent to which that therefore really calls for bringing the kinds of humanities and specifically medical humanities work that I've been talking to you about, bringing that more directly into a kind of public engagement with the COVID response is just so essential to getting us to a better future where we are able to move beyond the pandemic, not only in terms of the transmission of the virus, but also in terms of the kinds of societal healing that actually will need to occur after all of this trauma. So I will stop there and open it up for questions. I'd be happy to hear from you, your thoughts and reflections and any questions for clarification.
Dr. Ostherr, there is a question from Julie in the chat.
Electra, can I just say I did post a question, but before I heard some of your comments, I'd like to put that question aside and ask you. I know that the Biden-Harris team has posted or has announced a group, I think it was 10 or maybe 12 people who are going to be their COVID planning group. I personally do not know who's on that group. I heard a couple of names. They were people that I didn't know. It wasn't like Dr. Fauci or the other names that we've heard so much of in the last months. But perhaps you know who those 10 people are, and have they followed what you pointed out, the German model, where other areas like philosophers or humanities people are integrated into the planning group? Do you know? Can you comment on that?
You know, I saw a headline about that this morning, but I only saw, I think, 4 of the people that were included. So I don't know what the total composition is. They were all scientists. They were in medicine and public health, though I will say one of them is a dean in the who specializes in global health equity in the School of Public Health at Yale. And that in itself signals a certain orientation, which I think is extremely important, because it's not just about the question of the biology of the disease or of any kind of vaccine response, but it's about the social consequences of the ways that the disease has spread and access to resources to fight it have been so unequally distributed. So that to me is promising, because I also, I mean, I have a master's of public health in addition to having a PhD in media studies, and doing the MPH, I was really struck by how humanities-based so much of public health is. It's fascinating, actually. I mean, obviously things like epidemiology, you know, is a scientific practice, but to me, epidemiology is all about gathering a bunch of data and then figuring out the narrative that it's telling. And so to me, that is very promising. But that said, I hope that there will be more similarity to the German model, because it opens up dialogues that are already in the background, right? But that if we don't address them head on, we leave a lot of really fundamental aspects of the social experience of this pandemic. We leave them out. You know, if we don't think about how the kind of mass scale of suffering is actually going to affect the ways that people make choices about what is a good life to live, for example. If we don't think about that and how that is actually occurring on a societal scale, nationally and globally, we're not going to be able to see the future clearly at all.
One of our members has commented in the chat line that there were 15 people on the task force, and they're listed in, I guess, the New York Times today, but they're all well-known medical experts. So we're not, maybe we can as a group write a letter and say, add some philosophers and other humanities types into your planning groups.
Yes, I mean, I think that kind of advocacy is very important, and that's part of how I think about the public translational work that I do, that I try to get out into more mainstream venues, because you know, I want it to reach people who are in decision-making positions like that.
Anne Goldstein has a comment. Would you like to talk about it, Anne?
Yes. First, I don't know where you're located physically.
I'm in Houston.
Pardon? You're in Houston. Okay.
Yes.
So you've probably seen the weekly video messages that our president at Baylor College of Medicine has been sending out to everybody in the Baylor community. And then and we're encouraged to pass this on, okay? And he had some very moving images with a couple message, which is that every time people would complain about wearing the masks, and it's hard. I mean, if you talk to somebody who's had to wear one of these things 8-10 hours, I mean, I heard it from a hairdresser, I heard it from a person at the grocery store. I mean, you know, so every time he would hear that complaint, he would say, you know, if you're uncomfortable wearing a mask, you're gonna really not like having a tube down your throat.
Right.
And to be completely surrounded by, you know, breathing machines and oxygen containers and all that. So it was a compelling message to, you know, get over these low-level complaints that, and get with the, you know, the program of the bigger picture. And again, on that same idea of the bigger picture, I was aware of the, you know, the connection that you would make to Africa and to the countries that have not white skins. And so, yeah, I hadn't thought about how that would be used in such a way, because as a biologist, another factor is the amount of human-animal direct contact interaction in that country. So of course, you know, if you've been to Africa, you know how close you get to, and you know, you go where there aren't any paved roads, and you're really not in contact with the environment the way you are in Houston or any even small towns in, you know, in America. I mean, even if you live on a farm, it's more controlled than anything. And of course, then in the very beginning, they had that compelling information about the open market at Wuhan, where they were selling all these live animals. I remember as in the 60s, we did have Chinese restaurants that still had caged animals in the back of the restaurants. Okay, you don't see that today. They're not live animals. And we used to joke about cat fried rice, because why were there all these cats in cages behind Chinese restaurants? So there's that factor, that there needs to be more inclusion of understanding of humans with potential disease vectors. And because things that we thought we had conquered still pop up sometime in the United States. I mean, yellow fever, cholera, what's the thing now, I'm blanking on the name, but what you would get from eating uncooked pork, schistosciasis. Yeah, so there's that factor. So that's another thing. And I know you've covered this briefly, but I just wanted to congratulate you on really, covering the water and, suggesting some ways that you might really follow up on that. And then the third thing was the multiple vectors acting at one time. And so what was conspicuously absent to me, as somebody who has trained one of the most brilliant students ever from Rice, who is now one of the 3 key people in a vaccine center at Duke University. And so I'm on that edge all the time, finding about what we really know about that little image, because he is doing the 3-dimensional reconstructions of these various components. Now, what does that have to do with anything? Everybody loves seeing that little picture and think, well, I know what it is. No, actually, you don't even begin to know what even one little knob is all about. And so the third thing was that you didn't, not you personally, but we in general, never really explained why your immune system is so key in all this. And I think it's an easy message to get across. And so I keep waiting, for somebody besides Cliff Dashow, professor of medicine and multiple other things at Baylor College of Medicine. He has had some good slides, but it's not widely available. And so for people to understand a little bit more about the virus is doable. And to link that to why it affects old people, and it's old people and people who have compromised immune systems because their body is busy taking care of chronic problems. So we all know about that. But somehow nobody ever really made the connection between why your immunity and the health of your immunity is your strongest ally. And that's something that individuals can do in addition to wearing the mask. So, okay, I'm sorry. I'm gonna let you talk down through.
Well, I'll just add a couple things. So one is that in addition to the comment I made about, historians who've done research on past pandemics and what we can learn from them, it's also true that the history of colonialism is really, really important in understanding all of this, because many of these scenarios in which the media representations of sites of outbreak make it seem as though there is some kind of lack of civilization that is the cause of this spillover that then causes these outbreaks, really fails to acknowledge the ways that there have been external forces that have really shaped local, social, and cultural and economic arrangements, such that I've seen a number of critical analyses that have said things like, we caused the coronavirus, essentially, as the headline, because what they're basically saying is, you know, it didn't just like start here out of nowhere. We have to really think about how human, animal, and other kinds of relationships have existed over centuries, and what the kind of power dynamics that have shaped the globe, how they've played into that. So like the film that I showed a clip from, The Eternal Fight, you know, I've written extensively about that, and I just gave you kind of a little snippet. But when you think about global transportation playing an important role in the spread of infectious diseases, right? It's like, well, where did that come from, and why was that developed? It was developed to serve interests that wanted to access certain parts of the world and then bring things and people back from those parts of the world, right? So when you think about it that way, then it gets so complicated to look at these layers of influence in terms of what the different elements are that combine to produce then these moments of outbreak, of which we are having more and more, right? And so then we can think about climate in relation to all of that and the human role in that. So again, there are so many layers that I think, I mean, one really important thing to take from all of this is that there's no single discipline that can give us the answer, right? Like we need biologists, we need virologists, we also need historians, and we need anthropologists, and we need philosophers. So to me, it's really, really interesting to look at the insights that you can get when you look from all these different perspectives and realize just the degree of complexity of what we're dealing with, which makes it more comprehensible how difficult a situation we are now in that we have to figure out how to get out of. So yeah, I mean, there's much more I could say about that, but I think there may be other questions that I don't want to neglect.
Piper has a question.
Okay.
I was wondering if you think the U.S. will be able to move to safe behaviors and new, near universal mask wearing with the change in the administration, or is it too late? You know, are we already so divided on this coronavirus, being a hoax, or it's not important to me? And I mean, I think I'm sad to say that I think we're going to have more infections and more deaths before before Biden is inaugurated. And I don't know if that's going to change people's minds, or do you have any thoughts on that? And while I was thinking about it a little more, I was thinking about how other countries had like fun songs about washing your hands and wearing your mask and things that we could get, like you showed, get creatives to help out with that.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, I saw that just today, for instance, the governor of Utah issued a mask mandate statewide. These things have to, I think that generally speaking, the most effective interventions have to be bottom up rather than top down. However, in cases like this, it has to come from both sides, right? We have to have policies that are actually enforced, that show like, this is what you have to do and this is the consequence of not doing it. But we have to have a kind of on the ground uptake that comes from communities understanding enough of what their interest is in doing so, and going along with it, embracing the restrictions that are needed. So yes, all of this has gotten extremely politicized in ways that are totally counterproductive. But government must still govern, right? And so if we do have policymakers who insist, because I mean, all of our experts are predicting that it is going to get far worse before it gets better. So if our policymakers do take actions, perhaps they will take more actions without worry of being penalized now for doing so. And perhaps that will lead to more mask wearing. I mean, we do know that universal mask wearing would go a really long way, right? a really long way. And we know that we have the technology to make that happen. What we don't have is the will, the social will right now. So, you know, that's probably not a very satisfying answer to your question, because I don't think there is a satisfying answer to that question right now. But I don't think it's impossible. I mean, I think that it's just, we will see some shifts. Some of them will be driven by the ongoing tragedy that is going to keep occurring for a while, that we can't put a stop to instantly. But part of it is probably, I think, going to be a result of political shifts that have policy implications.
I would like to add that this summer, when Hurricane Laura was headed our way, we drove to Mineral Wells, which is west of Fort Worth, and so into more rural parts of Texas. And I was impressed. I thought it was interesting that the gas station's signs on the front door said, Governor Abbott has mandated that you must wear a mask. And so they're kind of taking that, he's your Republican guy, you need to listen to him. It's not us, you know, it's not me, the store owner, telling you to wear the mask. I thought that was pretty smart use of, you know, partisanship to say this is universal. This is the governor of Texas saying you need to do this.
However, they say that here, they just don't mention the governor. No store that I have been to says, my store says don't wear a mask. They all say some form of city government.
Right, but I thought it was interesting that over there they're like, oh, you might listen to the Republican governor, so we're going to put his name on the sign, you know, as opposed to here where it's different. So.
Well, I can tell you, I'll just say this briefly, but what you're touching on is actually a huge debate and dilemma in global health communication. And I know this because I've spoken with people at the World Health Organization, as well as the person in Hong Kong who led their SARS response when they had that massive outbreak a few years ago. And what they were both worrying about, and this conversation was in the context of a presentation I gave in Hong Kong about the Zika virus research that I was telling you about, that you could easily kind of shift into COVID research. But what they were saying was, now that we live in this world where there's not this kind of broadcast model of communication where you have to basically have a television network or a film studio in order to get a message out on a really wide scale, now that it can come from all these different sources, the challenge that we're facing is, how do we transmit our messages in a form that people will engage with, instead of the other kinds of communications that are also out there that they're competing with. The style of the communication plays a huge role in that. And that is not something that the WHO knows how to handle, because the WHO has a set of practices that they abide by that are not about being a media producer. That's not like their mission. They're scientists, right? This is why I think that efforts like their call for creatives are so important, because, you know, that's where they're recognizing we have to actually partner with people on the ground in many, many different parts of the world so that they can tell us what will work, basically, and in their community, so that they won't just see our messages as this kind of like totally alien and out of touch communication that sounds like something that you will just tune out, right? So I think that those kinds of efforts are extremely important, but it's a lot more challenging. It's a lot easier to produce one message that you send everywhere around the world, right? That is much easier than coming up with 1,000 different messages in 1,000 different languages and all of that. So it's a real challenge.
We've come to the end of our hour. So I have a lot more questions, but I'll have to think about these. And as a government broadcaster, believe me, we were thinking about these, but not social media. I mean, we were thinking about, should we broadcast in Guarani in Paraguay? Not, should I have Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all of that stuff? Anyway, Dr. Ostherr, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day and being with us today. I also want to thank Electra, who was our coordinator for this program. We really appreciate your working with Dr. Ostherr to make this happen. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in today. Just again to remind you, we have 2 author programs coming up. The first one is on November 18th, a Wednesday, with Sarah Rossett. She's a mystery writer. And the second one is on December 7th, a Monday, with Mike Friedman. It's a novel about consulting firm here in Houston. And those are both at 7 p.m. And we will continue our lunchtime programs in the spring semester. And you'll be getting email reminders about that. So once again, thank you all for coming today, for participating, and a special thank you to our featured speaker. We all learned a lot from you today, so thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.